Did you know that for centuries, Japanese women have contributed to the literary arts in ways that Western women could only dream of? They shaped art forms and gave an entire society the ability to express themselves. Let me explain. Most of you may know the mythology behind the creation of the Japanese islands and the birth of the Japanese people themselves, who are ruled by the descendants of the goddess Amaterasu. So, in other words, the imperial line. The entire mythology and story was compiled during the Nara period, mostly to lend relevance and claim absolute power for the imperial line. But did you know that the stories were orally delivered by a female attendant in the court? This woman was charged with creating an entire mythology. That's pretty badass. Now, you have to understand that at the time, most women lacked any formal educational training because of the patriarchal structure of the family. And this is because of the influence of Chinese Confucian ideology. So they either could not write or they were not permitted to write. And the language used in the court was classical Chinese. And if you didn't know, it's because the Japanese didn't originally have their own native written language. They borrowed it from the Chinese, so that's what the scholars of the court wrote in. But do you know what women did? The women of the Heian court created their own hand. In other words, they created their own freaking written language. This is now known as hiragana, which is the native Japanese written language, and it was created by women. Women weren't constrained by the rigid so-called proper poetic forms. Instead, they created new forms of writing outside of restrictive poetic structures. We're talking new forms of poetry, prose, writing diaries, and the first novel ever written, The Tales of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. The literary arts were very clearly gendered. Female expression was limited to informal observations and impressions. But educated women of the Heian court decided to just bust through the gender divide. We're talking flaunting social etiquette. And if you know anything about Japanese culture, etiquette is everything. What they began to do is scatter Chinese letters, which were only supposed to be used by the men, throughout their work, like Sei Shonagon. She's best known for the Pillow Book, which is full of observational musings of her time in court. And if you want a super fun read, I highly suggest it. But this meant that women were having all the fun. Men began to emulate the emotional informality and freedom of expression that women's writing had, but they really didn't have a hope of recreating it. You have to understand that literature has always played a crucial role in the creation of the image and place of the Japanese woman in society. When the Meiji government first overtook the Tokugawa shogunate, the first sweeping waves of feminism arrived in Japan, and this is from the influence of Western cultures seeping into the country. Feminist movements began to publish their own literature and journals, like Blue Stocking. What they wanted to do is exert their own femininity and to stimulate the creativity of other women. But more importantly, they needed an outlet to reclaim their own voices, especially after years of conscious repression. We're talking about trying to cast off the Neo-Confucian ideologies that had slowly seeped into Japanese society during the Edo period. And it never really left. Even as women began to speak out more, a creative and talented woman was seen as an exception. And men really did not pull their punches when it kept to trying to keep women down. They really did not want women in the spotlight. And they went as far as to openly attack female writers in order to declare their male superiority. Women needed a platform to voice their own frustrations and need for liberation. A place that they could discuss social issues. Something outside the propagated frame of the good Japanese woman. The expectation was for women to conform to the social attitudes of the time that men wanted. And we're talking about the subservience that was sponsored by the state in the good wife, wise mother movement. And women push back. The thing is men have a habit of labeling what a woman should be. And you know what? That's not up to you. That's up to me. But higher levels of literacy and education leveled the playing field a bit when it came to creative outlets. Women's literature became a form of segregation, a derogatory term full of condescension. But feminist writers did not take it lying down. Instead, they constructed the independence of the new woman. Okay, this is someone who challenged the family structures and marriage and motherhood, or even having to have kids. Of course, men continued to slight any progress they made. It was post-war Japan that brought about a more egalitarian vision of education for men and women in Japan. And it lacked that militaristic, nationalistic stranglehold that it had before. There were more opportunities outside that narrow view of the wise mothers and good wife movement, with the promise of higher education. And women, they flocked to occupations outside the home, including innovation and creativity. Women have always been at the forefront of innovation and change, always pushing the element and breaking boundaries. With the long history of women's contribution to the literary arts and language, this really shouldn't be a surprise. But somehow it always seems to get swept under the rug. Even now, some of the most popular and influential pop culture has come from women in Japan. For example, the ever-popular Sailor Moon. It made leaps and bounds overseas with the influential spread of Japanese culture throughout the world. I mean, women in manga itself can be dated back to the post-war period. 1946, I think, the same year that women got the vote in Japan. It was something as simple as a 4-comic panel called Sazai-san. You know, when they first created shoujo manga, it was targeted at young girls and women through magazines. But these magazines were all run by men and had all male editors. And what they really did is push the romance and lots of floweriness. Because men always have this idea of what women should be. But the reality is, no woman is the same. And in fact, these attempts actually failed. Because when written by men, female characters sort of lack that spark that really interests us. Honestly, the characters were just too passive and uninteresting, and they didn't gain any popularity. I mean, men have always had their hand in the pot. But by the 1960s, women were starting to overtake men in the field of manga, especially manga dedicated to women. And this really helped influence the boom of 1970s feminism. So many more women are in creative fields in Japan now, and many of them are winning high prestigious awards. Some of them are helping restructure and reshape genres, because the logical step, like in the Heian period, is if men can't write a likable, relatable female character, women should step in, right? We need more women in literature and TV and movies and comics and everything. Because the influence of a female voice behind a character helps define and shape the world. We need to be heard.